Good evening, and welcome to Skep Talk, the monthly speaker series hosted by the Bay Area Skeptics. Before tonight's presentation, a few words about Bay Area Skeptics. As North America's oldest skeptical organization, we are dedicated to promoting critical thinking, logic, and rational thought. In the 1970s and 80s, scientists such as Carl Sagan and magicians such as James Randi established the scientific skepticism movement out of concern about the popular fondness for pseudoscience and the lack of public science literacy. Scientific skepticism embraces evidence-based civil discourse on health, education, consumer protection, and especially the investigation of extraordinary claims. Using the scientific method, we hope to promote skeptical inquiry to reduce irrational thinking in society. This talk is supported by Bay Area Skeptics members such as you. Please visit us at baskeptics.org or join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Meetup. Consider supporting us through convenient monthly donations via Patreon. Patrons receive premiums such as discounts and free t-shirts for our annual Skeptical Conference. But more importantly, members help us make the world just a little more reasonable and rational. And now, tonight's speaker.
Good evening. I'm Eugenie Scott. I'm a board member of Bay Area Skeptics. Our guest tonight is somebody that most of the skeptics in our audience will know very, very well, Dr. Massimo Pigliucci. From 2002 through 2015, Massimo wrote a column for Skeptical Inquirer titled Thinking About Science. He took a break from SI for a couple of years, but everybody was very happy when he returned in 2022 with his new column, The Philosopher's Corner. So faithful readers of SI, therefore, have had many opportunities to read his musings about a wide variety of topics in science, skepticism, pseudoscience, and philosophy of science. He's someone who has thought a lot about the nature of science, the relationship between science and philosophy, and of course, pseudoscience and how it relates to science and our society. I'm really happy that he's agreed to speak for us tonight. He's an old friend. Massimo is one of the best educated speakers we've ever had at Bay Area Skeptics, and he's probably heard this joke 100 times, but I'm going to tell it anyway because you haven't heard it, so why not? He emigrated to the United States from his native Italy in 1990 after obtaining a PhD in genetics at an Italian university. He went on to earn a second PhD, this time in evolutionary biology, from the University of Connecticut. Both of these degrees focused on phenotypic plasticity, and much of his early research in evolutionary biology continued in this field. It's a really interesting field, by the way. After a postdoc at Brown University, Massimo went on to teach and do research at the University of Tennessee, which is where we met, actually, over our shared interest in the creationism and evolution controversy. I think we met at the second Darwin Day conference. You may not know that Massimo began the Darwin Day tradition, which he instituted at the University of Tennessee in 1997 and directed it there for several years. And Darwin Day, as you perhaps know, is celebrated by scientists and those of us who love science all over the world. It was while he was a professor at the University of Tennessee that an old interest in philosophy reemerged, and he decided to pursue formal study. And he completed his third PhD in philosophy of science at the University of Tennessee in 2003. His academic path took him to SUNY Stony Brook, where he worked in the Department of Ecology and Evolution before moving to City University of New York in the Department of Philosophy, where he holds an endowed chair. This is probably his last PhD, but I'm sure he's open to suggestion if you'd like to suggest another discipline that he might head off to. In addition to authoring or editing several books on evolutionary biology and, more recently, books on philosophy, he has authored books intended for the general public that skeptics are quite aware of, such as Tales of the Rational, Denying Evolution, Creationism, Scientism, and the Nature of Science, and Nonsense on Stilts, which is subtitled How to Tell Science from Bunk, which actually you'd think would be obvious, but it isn't actually that easy. In addition, he's a prolific essayist, most recently in the newsletter The Philosophy Garden, and previously with the blog Rationally Speaking. He also co-hosted the long-running Rationally Speaking podcast with Julia Galef from 2010 through 2015. His talk for us this evening is titled The Problem with Scientism and the Nature of the Skeptic Community. Welcome to Bay Area Skeptics, Massimo.
It's a pleasure to be here, Jeannie. And yeah, you're right. We did meet at a Darwin Day back, must have been, 98? Something like that?
Probably. I think it was the second one, because I wasn't there in 97, but it was in 98.
Yeah.
And we had a big argument over philosophy of science, and we eventually converged in our views, which was
right.
very...
Oh, wait a minute. That's how you remember it? Because I remember it as I came in at some point and I said, yeah, you were right. So,
well, yeah, but I didn't want to put it that way because, nobody likes an I told you so, right? And that's not how I feel about it. I would prefer to say we converged in our views.
Fair enough.
This is why they call me Darwin's golden retriever.
As opposed to a Rottweiler, right?
I think Richard Dawkins has been referred to as Darwin's greyhound.
Okay. Good enough.
That's too. You probably know Ken Miller, right?
Yes.
Our wonderful advocate for evolution in the creationism and evolution issue. And I once referred to him as Darwin's border collie, and he was insulted. This is a guy who knows dogs, so he wasn't insulted because he thought border collies were dumb. I mean, Darwin's golden retriever is not necessarily a compliment, right?
Right.
They're kind of cute, but they're kind of dumb. But they really get along with everybody. So you know what? Sure. Anyway, I described Ken once as Darwin's border, and he was all offended because he has Australian shepherds. So should I ever be in that position to compare him and for Canis familiaris one more time, I will be sure to use him appropriately.
Yes, use the appropriate dog. That's right.
Well, speaking of old friends, this has been kind of a tough year. I noted I was looking for your obituary that you wrote for Dan Dennett in Skeptical Inquirer, and I realized, oh, wait a minute, I don't have my Skeptical Inquirer. So I went online and I was looking for it there. And apparently there had been some sort of a mistake with my subscription and I hadn't received a couple of issues. So I still haven't read your obit, but I understand it was very gracious.
Thank you.
And understandably so. We all admired him a great deal.
Absolutely. Dan is one of the reasons I got into professional philosophy in the first place. I mean, he wrote a very, very nice letter of recommendation for me for City University of New York. So I basically got my job.
Yeah. Well, he's like that. But that is very good. Well, you and I can visit for a very long time, but it would not be fair to our viewers. So even if I make jokes about the number of degrees you have, why don't we go ahead and hear what you have to say? Because your talk tonight combines both your science degree and your philosophy degree.
Right.
So take it away, Massimo.
Thank you. All right, everybody. So let's have some fun tonight. I'm going to try to keep my remarks to a rather short period of time because I think this is a controversial topic even for skeptics, and it would be fun to have Q&A and have a discussion about these things, and hopefully we will all learn something from it. So the topic is scientism, and scientism is perennially controversial among scientists, among philosophers, among skeptics included, and I often find myself in a pretty weird situation, I have to say. When, as Jeannie pointed out, a chunk of my career was as a scientist, and when I decided to switch over, I did what I thought was the right thing. I went back to school and get legitimate credentials in philosophy. I started publishing in philosophy, and naively, I was expecting my new colleagues in philosophy to say, hey, this guy is a scientist. He knows what he's talking about when it comes to philosophy of science because he was a scientist, and he has done the work. And so, let's hear what he has to say. I was also expecting my colleagues in the sciences to say, hey, he's one of us. We know him. Now he's in the philosophy, but let's hear. Of course, the result, the actual result is that often I turn out to be too much of a scientist for the philosopher's taste and too much of a philosopher for the scientist's tastes. So you can't please not only you can't please everybody, you can't please anybody. And when it comes to specifically the issue of scientism, it's really difficult to please anyone. So we'll see how it goes tonight. Let me start with the obvious. What is scientism? And there goes the trouble immediately, because even if you look up, forget the technical literature, there is a technical literature in philosophy about scientism, but forget that. If you just pick up the Oxford Dictionary, let's say, you immediately find two definitions of scientism. The first one is thought or expression regarded as characteristic of scientists. The second one says excessive belief in the power of scientific knowledge and techniques. So right there, you can see the problem, right? The first one, nobody would object to the first definition, thought or expression regarded as characteristics of scientists. Okay, it's a descriptive definition, not prescriptive. It doesn't say that there is anything right or wrong about the attitude. It just says it's whatever it is that scientists do, that's what we're going to call it scientism. The second one, on the other hand, is the bit that a lot of scientists and some philosophers object to, because there's this notion of excessive belief in the power of scientific knowledge. Some people argue that there cannot possibly be such a thing as an excessive belief in scientific knowledge, because what else are you going to believe? We'll see tonight whether how well this holds up to scrutiny. Interestingly, interest in scientism has gone up steadily. If you look up the use of the word in books using a Google Ngram or something like that, you'll see that the word scientism has steadily gone up since the 1940s, and it keeps climbing. So it's clearly this is a topic that people are interested in and about which there have been a number of discussions. Now, let me make clear what my position is about science before we get to scientism. As you heard, I'm a scientist myself, I'm an evolutionary biologist. I fully believe that science is by far the best approach that we have ever devised in order to discover how the world works. If we're talking about the world at large, the natural world, astronomy, chemistry, physics, you name it, science is the way to go. I don't know of anything else that comes even close to it. I am squarely, for instance, in the camp of a guy you might have heard of, Albert Einstein. He was, of course, a scientist, but he actually spent a significant amount of time thinking and writing about philosophy. And particularly, he was concerned with epistemology, which is the subfield of philosophy that deals with theory of knowledge, right? How do we know things? And Einstein spent a significant amount of time writing about epistemology, and one of his most famous articles includes this sentence: experience is the alpha and omega of all our knowledge of reality. By which he meant that you cannot discover things about the world by just sitting around and thinking about it. There is no such thing as armchair science. You can do theoretical science, as we all know. We did quite a bit of theoretical science. But his point was that if the theoretical science is decoupled, or in fact doesn't closely match the empirical evidence, then you're simply not doing science. Keep this in mind, because it will come handy in the rest of our discussion. So for Einstein, science is a particular combination of theoretical constructs on the one hand and empirical evidence. And that, to me, is the essence of science. If you're doing just theory with no input from empirical evidence, you're just not doing science. If you're doing, however, only empirical evidence without any kind of theoretical construct, without any kind of sort of attempt to sort of explain things in a more general fashion, then arguably also there you're not doing science. Science is this very interesting, fascinating combination of theoretical constructs, which we call theories or hypotheses, and empirical evidence. That said, there are a few things that scientists say about the nature of science and about the nature of philosophy that I find kind of disturbing. And I'm going to give you one example, and we're going to go in a little bit of detail in this example, because I think it's not only representative of what I want to talk about tonight, but it will give us quite a bit of food for thought. This is from Stephen Hawking, who presumably we all know. recently deceased cosmologist, one of the greatest scientific minds of the late 20th, early 21st century. Great. However, Hawking wrote the following. This is a quote. "Philosophy is dead because it has not kept up with modern developments in science, particularly physics. It is scientists, not philosophers, who are now the bearers of the torch of discovery in our quest for knowledge." Now, that sounds reasonable to a lot of people, but I think actually it's quite a bit of nonsense on stilts, to mention the title of one of my books. It really makes no sense, and we're going to go sentence by sentence in a minute over this, and I'll try to argue why Hawking was completely off with that sentiment. But he's not the only one. You can easily find very similar pronouncements made by people including Richard Dawkins, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Sam Harris, Jerry Coyne, and a number of others. Some of whom, or maybe all of whom, are in fact, as you probably know, kind of sacred cows in the skeptic movement. These are people we all look up to and we all admire for good reasons. But when they start talking about science and philosophy, or the relationship between the two, most of these people, I argue, don't really know what they're talking about, and they should do some homework first. All right, so let me go back to Stephen Hawking specific sentence. Let's take it the little paragraph that I read you. Let's take it one sentence at a time. The first sentence says, "Philosophy is dead because it has not kept up with modern developments in science." Now, this reflects, in my mind, a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of modern philosophy. Philosophy is simply not in the business of answering scientific questions, period. So to complain about the fact that that philosophy doesn't answer or is not helpful to science is barking up the wrong tree. Not only that, but philosophers of science very much keep up with the developments of science. And the reason for that is because otherwise they couldn't do philosophy of science. A lot of modern philosophy falls into the general category of philosophy of. There is philosophy of science, there is philosophy of language, there is philosophy of mind, there is a lot of philosophies of. This is aside from the traditional fields of philosophy, such as metaphysics, logic, epistemology, aesthetics, ethics, and things like that. Those are the core disciplines of philosophy. But especially over the last century or thereabout, a lot of philosophy is actually philosophy of something, philosophy of X. In fact, not even just philosophy of science in general, that's too generic. There are philosophers of evolutionary biology, there are philosophers of quantum mechanics, there are philosophers of relativity, and so on and so forth. And these people, I assure you, very much keep up with the field, because otherwise they would have nothing to say about these things. So in that first sentence, Hawking makes two fundamental mistakes. One, he misunderstands the nature of philosophy, and two, he apparently is unaware that philosophers of science, very much keep up with the science. In general, you want to think of perhaps this way. There are three related disciplines that study science from the outside, so to speak: history of science, sociology of science, and philosophy of science. None of them has as a goal the solution of scientific problems. Okay, so Hawking is completely off. He makes it what is essentially a category mistake. That is, he's applying a category of thought to something to which it doesn't really belong. And I suspect, and I'm sorry to say, that that's the result of ignorance on his part. The three fields in question do something very different. They don't try to solve scientific problems. What they do is, of course, history of science attempts to document and understand the development of science through time. Sociology of science is concerned with science as a human activity, complete, of course, with power structures, hierarchical relations, and so on and so forth. Because after all, science, as powerful as it is as a set of tools to understand reality, it's still a human activity. It's still done by human beings. And then philosophy of science is about the logic of scientific discovery. It's about the epistemic warrants, as philosophers put it, of scientific theories. That is, philosophers tend to ask themselves, well, scientists are making this or that kind of statement. Is it really backed up by the evidence? What kind of evidence? Why do they think this evidence is germane, and so on and so forth. And philosophers of science are also interested in the metaphysical assumptions of science. There's a lot of, most scientists are not aware of it because it's not their job, but science makes a number of philosophical assumptions, metaphysical assumptions in particular, about cause and effect, about the nature of causality, about the fact that we live in a deterministic universe, about the fact that phenomena are repeatable on a consistent basis, and so on and so forth. There is all sorts of assumptions that are philosophical in nature, not scientific. So for all these reasons, it makes absolutely no sense to complain that philosophy has not actually helped science recently. So that was the first sentence. The second sentence that I read from Hawking says, scientists are now the bearers of the torch of discovery in our quest for knowledge. Again, superficially, this sounds very reasonable and kind of hard to object against. But let's slow down for a minute here. What does Hawking actually mean by knowledge? Right? It could mean knowledge of the natural world, in which case it would be right, but then the statement becomes trivially uncontroversial. If you just say that science is the best way to solve, to approach issues of natural science, well, then, yeah, you're right. Absolutely. That is the kind of knowledge that science, of course, has always been designed to provide. And it's really no surprise that science is the best tool at doing that sort of stuff. He's not saying anything profound there. Could he mean something else? Could he mean something more, broader by the word knowledge? Instead of, sort of the natural world in particular, knowledge of the natural world in particular. Well, if he means all sorts of knowledge, or a broader version of knowledge than knowledge of the natural world, then I think he's quite wrong. For instance, knowledge of literature is not within the purview of science, and yet it's a kind of knowledge. I hope this is not a controversial statement. There are people who specialize in the history of literature, who specialized in the analysis of literary, texts and so on, and that's knowledge by any kind of definition of it. And yet, it's not scientific knowledge. It's not the kind of stuff that most scientists spend a lot of time on. Logic. I mentioned that logic is typically considered a branch of philosophy. Well, logic is also presumably about knowledge of a kind. We're going to get to that in a few minutes. But logic is not a science. It's not, it's useful to science, but it's certainly not science. Why is it not science? Because it doesn't depend at all on empirical evidence. Remember what Einstein said, that the alpha and the omega of our understanding of the natural world is the empirical evidence. Logic does not depend on empirical evidence at all. And you know what else doesn't depend on empirical evidence at all for statements of truth? Mathematics. Mathematics is also not a science, although some of my colleagues who are more scientistically oriented than I am want to claim it as a science, but it's not. And it's not for the same reason as logic. It is not. It doesn't actually have anything to do with empirical evidence. You don't prove mathematical theorems typically by empirical evidence. So the irony here is that Hawking wrote these things at the beginning of a book called The Grand Design. And that book is not really about science. It's about what I would call philosophy of science, specifically philosophy of cosmology. If you actually read that book, there is rather little science. There is a nudge to science here and there, but it's really a book about philosophy. And from that perspective, it's not really that good philosophy, which is not surprising, considering that Hawking was not, in fact, a philosopher. Now, we've been talking about knowledge, so allow me a little bit of a parenthesis here to help, again, provide some food for discussion. Ever since Plato, a philosopher, knowledge has been defined as JTB, as philosophers call it, justified true belief. That is, if I say that I know something, what I mean is that I have a justified true belief about something. So if I say that I know X, and I'll give you an example in a minute, that means that A, I believe X. It would be really weird to say that I know that X is true, but I don't believe it. Second, that X is likely to be true as far as we can tell, right? As far as we can ascertain. And third, and this is the tricky part, I am in a position to justify that belief. That is, if you ask me, well, how do you know? Then I'll give you an account of how I know things, okay? I'll get to an example in just a minute. So bear with me for a little bit longer. Now, this is certainly one conception of truth, of knowledge, justify true belief, but it uses the word truth. And there are different kinds of truth. And I'm not talking about, my truth is just as good as yours. I'm not talking about any kind of, epistemic relativism or something like that, or other ways of knowing. I'm talking about serious definitions of truth. What do we mean by truth? Well, there are at least two major, again, philosophical accounts of truth. There are actually several, but there are two that I'm going to focus on tonight. One is the so-called correspondence theory of truth. A correspondence theory of truth is something means that something is true if, in fact, my words, my sentences, my what I state about this thing corresponds with, as far as we can tell, with the state of affairs in the real world. For instance, if I say the planet Saturn has rings, well, is that statement true or not? Well, it's true just in case Saturn really does have rings. And, we can point a telescope to Saturn and check it, or we can send a spacecraft to Saturn and check it, and it turns out that it is, in fact, true. So if I say Saturn has rings, I am using implicitly, although I might not even, as a scientist, I might not even be aware of the fact that that's what I'm doing, but I'm using a particular definition of truth, which is the correspondence theory of truth. My statement is true because it corresponds with the state of affairs out there in the world. But there are other definitions of truth. For instance, there is a coherence account of truth, which is useful especially in mathematics and logic. When you say, for instance, that the Pythagorean theorem is true, what do you mean? You probably don't mean the same thing that you meant when you said that Saturn has rings. It's not that you actually go and check real triangles in the real world and say, see, the theorem works. You give a proof, you give a formal proof of that theorem. That formal truth is based on a coherence internal to the system of proof. You're starting with certain axioms, including specifically the axioms of Euclidean geometry, and on the basis of those axioms, you are following certain rules of inference, and on the basis of those rules of inference, you prove that the Pythagorean theorem is true. So it's true, but it's true in a different sense from the correspondence theory of truth. And right there, therefore, when we say, science is about the search for truth, well, we need to be careful. It's about the search for certain kinds of truth, but not for truth in general. So as I said, science is mostly concerned with the first definition of truth, the correspondence, and logic and math tend to be concerned with the second one. Although there are exceptions, which we may get to discuss in the Q&A. But that again makes my point that logic and math are not sciences. Not only they don't depend on empirical evidence, they actually use a very different definition of truth. When mathematicians say that something is true, they don't mean the same thing as what a scientist means. Okay. Now, philosophers make also additional distinctions relevant to our discussions. For instance, they distinguish three different kinds of knowledge: knowledge that, knowledge of, and knowledge how. Knowledge that is propositional propositional knowledge. Scientific theories fall into this category, right? Scientific theories are propositions about the world. They are statements about the world. But there are other propositional truths that are not scientific necessarily. For instance, if you know that Turin is a city in northern Italy, that hardly qualifies as scientific knowledge, but it is in fact propositional kind of knowledge. There is also knowledge of, which is, for instance, knowledge of it's often referred to also as acquaintance knowledge. I know my friends, I know my parents, I know my daughter, I know my wife, etc., etc. That's very different kind of knowledge from propositional knowledge. Although part of that can be expressed in proposition, but only part. And then there is knowledge how. That's related to skills. I know how to ride a bike. I know how to play a saxophone, and so on and so forth. Those are also different kinds of knowledge. So you see that if you spend a few minutes thinking about truth and knowledge and that sort of stuff, immediately you come up with a lot of interesting complications, which are not part necessarily of the discussion in the simplistic way in which Hawking and other people put it. A colleague of mine, a philosopher named Susan Hack, put it in the pages of Skeptical Inquirer, because she writes occasionally for Skeptical Inquirer. He says, scientism is an exaggerated kind of deference towards science, an excessive readiness to accept as authoritative any claim made by the sciences, and to dismiss any kind of criticism of science or its practitioners as anti-scientific prejudice. That last sentence in particular is pertinent. One of the reasons people like Hawking and Neil deGrasse Tyson and so on and so forth get upset with philosophers is because philosophers have a tendency to occasionally criticize the scientific enterprise, specific aspects or specific instances of the scientific enterprise. And they do it from the outside. They do it from the point of view of somebody who studies the history, the sociology, and the philosophy of science. And you can see why that may create, in fact, conflict. Now, defenders of scientism point out that the word has been used by all sorts of purveyors of pseudoscience to attack legitimate science, and that's true. Everyone from theologians to ufologists to anti-vaxxers has used the word scientism as an insult and as a way to deflect or dismiss criticism of what they are saying, right, or their own statements. That is true, but so what? I mean, just because somebody, some certain people use a word inappropriately, that doesn't mean we should do it without the word. I mean, think about the very word skeptic, right? The word skeptic has also been misused quite a bit. There are self-professed climate change skeptics, vaccine skeptics, Holocaust skeptics, and so on and so forth. But we don't stop using the word skeptic just because there is this kind of misappropriation. We just shoot back, and we call these people deniers, not skeptics, right? So just because somebody, which is true, has misused the word scientist, that doesn't undermine the meaning and the usefulness of the concept in and of itself. It's just not a good argument. Now, there is a broader context, I think, in the long and unfortunate history of the conflict between the sciences and the humanities, which the discussion about scientism is a particular case of. And this is ironic, especially in the case of science and philosophy. Why is it ironic? Well, because historically speaking, science originated as a series of spin-offs from natural philosophy. For a long time, what we call science was actually considered natural philosophy, ever since the pre-Socratic philosophers back 2.5 millennia ago. Aristotle was just as much a scientist as a philosopher, and so was Descartes. And so were a bunch of others throughout the centuries. But then science became more and more specialized. It kind of started spinning off of the original general philosophical approach because we started having increased empirical evidence to back up our theories in natural philosophy, and these fields eventually became independent. The first field to become independent was physics. Think about Galileo or Newton. Followed by chemistry, Boyle. And then eventually biology, Darwin, and then finally, more recently, psychology, James. And the process is still going. What we've been calling for decades philosophy of mind, now it's increasingly its own field of neuroscience and cognitive science. Okay? Although that separation is still ongoing. While there is no longer a natural philosophy of physics, chemistry, or biology, or psychology even, because those fields are now completely independent, there is still a philosophy of mind that goes hand in hand with neuroscience. And in fact, a lot of neuroscientists are interested in what philosophers of mind have to say, and vice versa. Now, back in 1959, a guy named Charles Percy Snow wrote a highly influential essay entitled The Two Cultures, in which he criticized humanists for dismissing science. And he knew what he was talking about because he was actually originally a scientist, he was a chemist, and then he became a novelist right? And he criticized the humanists for dismissing science because at the time, believe it or not, this was only half a century, a little more than half a century ago, the humanities dominated the university departments, right? The sciences were definitely in the minority at that point, not in a position of power within universities. The general culture was a humanistic culture. It was not a scientific culture. Snow, as I said, was a chemist turned novelist, and so he had obviously experience in both fields. And at some point he commented, once or twice I have been provoked by my colleagues in the humanities, and I've asked the company how many of them could describe the second law of thermodynamics. The response was cold. It was also negative. Yet I was asking something which is about the scientific equivalent of, have you read a work of Shakespeare? Right? So he was criticizing justly his colleagues in the humanities for being contemptuous of science, dismissing science without actually understanding what they were talking about. Well, move forward half a century, and now the situation is completely reversed. We have so-called STEM fields that are dominant in universities, and the humanities are on retreat. And I think that's just as unfortunate as the original situation 50 years ago. It's too bad because we are not going to get a lot of answers about existential problems and social issues just from the sciences. We also need input from philosophy, history, literature. And it doesn't do anybody any good to put these fields in competition with each other. I wonder, for instance, inspired by Snow, I wonder how many physicists nowadays have read the works of Shakespeare, for instance, or Plato's Republic, and yet they are the humanistic equivalent of the second principle of thermodynamics. So let me conclude with a suggestion for a positive way forward, and then we're going to have a discussion, hopefully. Rather than engage in this game of dismissing the humanities on the one side and the humanists dismissing the sciences on the other side and claiming that only certain questions are worth answering or only certain fields are worth pursuing, et cetera, I think we ought to go back to the very roots of the word science itself. A little bit of etymology doesn't hurt in this case. I actually think a little bit of etymology never hurts, and often it's a lot of fun. But certainly in this case, the word science comes from the Latin, probably not surprisingly, and the Latin word is scientia, which is written with a T-I-A at the end. Scientia means knowledge or expertise in general, not just what we call scientific knowledge, but expertise and knowledge in general. It comes in turn from the Latin sciens, which means intelligent, skilled. So it's a quest. So scientia is a general quest for understanding, knowledge, expertise, intelligence, and skill. Beginning in the late 14th century, and this is important because this is the beginning of the Renaissance, scientia acquired the sense of collective human knowledge of all kinds, right? Not with the distinctions that I made earlier on. Especially knowledge, but not limited to knowledge that is gained by systematic observation, experiment, and reasoning. In other words, what we have actually eventually started calling science proper. So scientia, in other words, is what we should strive for, all of us. A general understanding, and the most encompassing understanding of things that can only come not from infighting and dismissing each other's field of expertise, but from coming together and say, okay, here's what physics or chemistry or biology or archaeology, etc., can say about this thing. What about literature? What about philosophy? What about the so-called social sciences, sociology, psychology, etc., etc. It is scientia that I think we should strive for, and that means that all these discussions about, oh, you're being too scientific or you're not being scientific enough, at the end of the day, actually undermine both the value of the humanities and the value of the sciences. What we need really is to include all of this under the broader possible umbrella of human knowledge and understanding, and hopefully wisdom. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You have given us a lot to think about, and I'm we'll wait while we're assembling some questions from the listeners. I was taking notes because, as it happens, my handwriting has gotten so terrible that I cannot read it. So I was sort of typing on my other screen over here, and so give me just a second to catch up with you. I want to toss out an idea. We're on the same page here as well as we are in so many other things. But I want to toss out a related idea that I think is worth thinking. I run into quite often even from our fellow skeptics, alas, the idea that science is the only way to know about anything that counts. Right. And of course, the understanding the empirical world is really important. I mean, understanding the natural world is it's great. We're all very keen on that. We want to do that. But what I find a lot of skeptics and other science fans saying is that even in our day-to-day decisions, anything having to do with empirical components, anything with empirical components, observation, logic, etc., well, science is the solution to that. Right. I have pushed back on that because, and basically we are agreeing, I'm just sort of going down one more level. I don't think that the scientific method, as most people conceive of it, is restricted to science. Mm-hmm. This idea of, have an idea that you're curious about, collect information about it, test that information against, various sources. It can be logic, it can be empiricism, it can be internal consistency, test it against something, and keep the stuff that's good and toss away the stuff that doesn't work. And of course, everybody kind of recognizes that as how we do science in the broad strokes. But it's also how you do good history.
Sure.
It's also how you do literary criticism. You don't just say, I think Poe wrote this, or I think Poe thinks this about criticism. Right. You need to actually go to sources. You need to evaluate statements. You need to really analyze whatever issue you're dealing with. And that's the same, I think, with the kind of individual issues that people sometimes bring when they say, we have to use science for everything. I think what they're really saying is we have to use critical thinking. If we can apply the word critical thinking to that sort of general broad brush approach that I think most people would recognize as science, but it's not restricted to us.
Right. No, I agree. I mean, so I've heard that kind of argument many times, even including from colleagues, not only skeptics, but colleagues in the sciences. And so here's the thing. At some level, we are having a discussion about semantics. And I know that people just, have a way to dismiss semantics and say, that's just semantics, as if semantics were not absolutely crucial. If we communicate and understand each other by language, if we don't use the language in a coherent fashion or in a way that we agree on, then we're literally talking past each other, there's just not going to be any agreement. So I think you're absolutely right. What any kind of human knowledge ultimately is the result of thinking about stuff, about facts, right? Yeah. As much as we can ascertain those facts, thinking as rationally as you say, using critical thinking about facts. That means that any kind of knowledge falls into the general category. Now the question is, well, do you want to call that science, or do you want to limit the word science to what most people understand nowadays? That is, you want to limit the word science to chemistry, physics, biology, et cetera, right?
Natural world.
Right, the natural world, and the certain ways of doing things. I mean, science is now a very complex set of disciplines with its own internal rules. Some of these rules are sociological in terms of, there are what philosopher Thomas Kuhn called the disciplinary metrics. The disciplinary metrics includes not only the methods, what we call the scientific method, but the basic assumptions that go in the field. How do you, the textbooks that you use to train graduate students, the conferences, the granting agencies, all of that sort of stuff. If we think that is science, then clearly science is only one particular, very important, very broad, but only one particular way of going about knowing things. If, on the other hand, we want to go Jerry Coyne and say that, I'm going to call science anything that has to do with reason and facts, okay, but then you have to understand that other people don't call that science. They call it philosophy, literature, history, and so on and so forth. So when Sam Harris, for instance, wrote the famous The Moral Landscape, right, which the subtitle of which is How Science Can Answer Moral Questions, right? Well, I bet that most readers approached that, bought that book and approached that book the way I did. That is, Sam is going to tell me how biology or neuroscience or something like that is going to answer moral questions. But that's not what he does. The very first or second endnote in that book says, by science, I mean any activity that deals with reasoning over facts. Well, okay, then sure, then it becomes trivial. That is, you're absolutely right. But it's trivially true. It's not very interesting. You don't write a book about that.
I mean, you could probably even consider musical composition a type of science, if that's, and I don't know anything about musical composition.
Yeah, exactly. Or, when I navigate the subway in New York City, I do science. Because,
you use critical thinking anyway.
I'm using critical thinking. I have a map. I have a theory. I have a map in my mind of how the subway system works. And I confront it with the empirical evidence. Oh, shoot, the number 2 trains doesn't go on the west side this weekend. It goes on the east side. So I'm going to adjust my map accordingly. Am I doing science? You can say that, but that becomes ridiculous and not particularly interesting. It's not insightful. Right.
That's the kind of hegemonic scientism, if you will, that pisses off people outside of science.
Exactly. And that's exactly what it is. It's hegemony. It's an attempt at hegemony.
Yeah. And I don't think we're going to succeed if we're always saying "I told you so."
Yeah, but sometimes that's true.
I was thinking of something when you just mentioned semantics, but also earlier you were talking about so what if people take the word scientism and misuse it? I think ultimately we have to have understandings of the words that we use. Otherwise, we're just not going to be talking to each other. And I think just taking an example from my own field of biological anthropology, many years ago, when I was a very young assistant professor, I wrote an article about race. No sense in dealing with things that are controversial when you're trying to get tenure.
Right.
Oh, well.
Didn't somebody advise you against that kind of stuff? Oh, well.
No, somebody probably should have. But actually, I published it in such an obscure journal that I don't think more than 15 people have read it. But I actually went back to it a while ago when I was going to be giving a talk about race. And what's all that stuff about population structure and stuff? So I went back and I kind of reread some of this stuff because it was, this was back in the late 60s, early 70s. Mm-hmm. And that was a time in the field of biological anthropology when there was a huge amount of scholarship being done on race. Yeah. And what does it mean? And I think everybody in my field really understood that how we use the word race and how it's used in the general public is just completely talking past each other. Yeah. It's worse than the word theory. Oh, yeah. Which you and I, in dealing with creationism, tear our hair out. Mm-hmm. But I ended this little discourse on race in this obscure article that nobody's read, with saying, nobody's born understanding words. You have to learn what words mean. So let's just double our efforts and really try hard so that everybody understands that races are temporary. It's the subspecies of sparrows. They're temporarily I can't say that word. They're suitable to only a single time.
Yep.
And they will
Temporally
change
limited,
over
yep.
time.
Yep.
And they're not permanent entities. They're not, you know, incipient species, et cetera, et cetera. So all these things that races are not, we just teach people that. And I, you know, once I got teaching a whole lot more, and I did teach a course in modern human variation. We didn't call it race. We called it modern human variation.
Right.
And I dealt with all of these principles, and my students still, you know, would sort of default to their understandings, their street understandings of race. Once they got out of my classroom, I kind of beat it out of them in terms of my classroom. But I think people have folk understandings of words that are very permanent, which is why when I was at NCSE, for those of you who are watching, I used to run a science education nonprofit that tried to keep evolution in the schools. So I spent a lot of time trying to help people understand evolution, and also why creationism should not be taught in the schools. But what, and whoosh, the idea went right out of my brain very, very quickly.
Oh, that happens all the
Don't
time.
get old. You know, Massimo, take my word for it. Don't get old, because you forget things like that.
I'll try. I'll try to remember that.
Please do. But, you know, I would try to make people understand the word theory. And I realized after I, you know, dealt with this topic at NCSE for a while, that if I really wanted people to understand what a scientific theory was, I couldn't use the word theory.
Yeah.
You know, I would just say, you know, that I didn't call it a construct, because then you have to explain constructs.
Right. That would have been the first word that came to my mind. But you're right. Then you have to explain what a construct is. Right.
But that doesn't fly when you're talking.
No.
You know, I would talk about the concept of evolution, or the explanation of evolution. That's what I used most of the time.
Yeah.
You know, but once you said theory of evolution, immediately people would go kerchunk. And they'd go back to that, oh, it's a hunch or a guess or something. Yeah. And no matter how hard you tried to talk about the theory of the cell, or the germ theory, they somehow never really thought that theories were something, you know, germ theory was something that you had to doubt some of the time. Although we're getting there, are we not?
Yeah, I know, right? Yeah, sometimes I use the word account, which is more popular in philosophy. So philosophers don't talk about. Sometimes they talk about philosophical theories, but it's more a philosophical account. So you give an account of something. In other words, you tell a coherent story about something that hopefully is going to hold up to scrutiny. That sort of approach.
So if that sounds very tentative.
Yes, it does sound very tentative.
And if you want to talk about the germ account. All right. I'm monopolizing your time. Can we have the first question, please? The first definition of scientism leads to non-scientists making things sound science-y. Criticism is warranted, but do you have thoughts on how we combat this?
Well, how we combat this is, of course, by education. But the problem is, how do you educate people about these things without running into the kind of problems that Jeannie just pointed out? Yeah, you're right. There are some ways of thinking about scientists that lead, as you said, non-scientists making sciencey sounding things. But I think that's just an issue that we have to deal as scientists and as educators, right? There are lots of people that sound in a certain way, and then you need to dig a little deeper to make sure that what they're saying, and then if need be, expose what they're saying. Look, the general approach that I use at this point, anytime that I do science education or I do skepticism, is I limit my expectations. When I was young, I thought that, you get somewhere on a stage or in a classroom and you explain things, and since you're so good at explaining things, surely people will understand it, and then that would be it,
From
right?
their eyes, right?
Yeah, right. Guess what? It doesn't work that way. I discovered empirically, right? So For instance, I gave a talk recently at the CSI conference just a couple of months ago, and my talk was precisely about the meaning and limits of skepticism. And I thought, look, I've approached things now the way in which Carl Sagan, I think, approached them. If you remember one of his best books in my mind, The Demon Hunted World, the subtitle of that book was Science as a Candle in the Dark. Mm-hmm. And I now keep constantly that image, that metaphor in my mind. My goal is not to bring light to the whole world. My goal is to make sure, as much as it is possible, that the candle is still lit. It doesn't go out, right? And you might say, well, that's not enough. That's, too limited, whatever it is. But I know I can do that work, that job. I also pretty sure I cannot do the more, the bring light everywhere. We have tried, plenty of good people, much better people than I am, have tried over 2.5 millennia of bringing light to the world. And look at where we are. So
no, we have a lot of light in the world. I mean, I just had cataract operations and I can see. I wasn't able to see worth crap a month ago.
That's right. Yeah, that helps.
There have been some real improvements, believe me.
And that's science, man.
Yeah, that is science. I mean, yes, it's a candle in the dark, but there's a lot of candles out there and it's brighter than it used to be.
That's right.
And there's nothing wrong, there's nothing wrong with trying to encourage other people to light more candles.
Right. But one of the things that we also need to realize is that there are interesting discussions to be had also within the skeptic movement itself, right? Like the one we're having tonight. I mean, there is reasonable disagreement about all sorts of issues, even within skeptics, and there better be. People sometimes forget that the word skeptic actually literally means inquirer, right? Somebody who asks questions, which is why I told, we were mentioning earlier on, Ginny, about people who have passed away recently. Ken Fraser is another one, right?
Yeah.
And he was a great person. I think he was a great person.
He was terrific.
And, I worked with him for many, many years, and I used to tease him. And I said, we should really change the title of Skeptical Inquirer, because it literally means inquire. It's like ATM machine, right? It's redundant, but he never took me up on it for some reason. Whatever, it's fine. Probably because there is already a magazine called Skeptic, so that's probably why.
Well, I think Skeptical Inquirer preceded the Skeptic, but
it certainly did. It certainly did. Yes.
May I have the next question, please? Annika writes, what about the role of mathematics with respect to science? Studying the math constraining the structure appearing in science surely guides and shapes scientific inquiry.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I've had discussions. In fact, one such discussion was a number of years ago with Dan Dennett and Lawrence Krauss, the physicist. And one of the topics, this was in Ghent in Belgium. You can actually find that online. It's on YouTube. And one of the discussion points was about scientism. And at some point, Lawrence turned to me and said, but math is a science. And I said, no, it's not. And Dan Dennett mediated between the two of us, but in the end, ended up agreeing with me. No, it isn't. But that doesn't mean it's not very useful to science. Of course it is. Although it is, to be fair, more useful to some sciences than others. You will not find a single equation in Darwin's Origin of Species, for instance. And you will find a lot of math in modern biology, but of a very different kind that you find in, let's say, fundamental physics or in chemistry. It's a lot more about statistics than about, actual analytical approaches to things. And there are good reasons for it. You can write down, by training, I'm a population and statistical geneticist, and you can write down the equations in population genetics that describe the theoretical behavior of populations in response to, let's say, natural selection, mutation, et cetera, but you will not be able to solve those equations because they get immediately extremely complicated given the number of genes, the number of individuals, the number of factors, et cetera, and so you resort to statistical treatment instead of analytical one. So is mathematics... What is the relationship, therefore, between mathematics and science? I think that mathematics is, from the scientist perspective, it's an incredibly useful tool, but it's a tool. Mathematicians, what most mathematicians do most of the time has actually nothing to do with science. It's their own, they have their own field, they do their own things, and they have nothing to do with either science or, in fact, anything in the real world as far as we can tell. They study theoretical structures that, for the overwhelming majority of the cases, have nothing to do with the empirical world. Occasionally, it does happen that one of these structures turns out to be very surprisingly relevant in a way that nobody expected before, and then you have a breakthrough. Then you have mathematics either explaining or leading science through to a breakthrough. How does that work? Well, that's an interesting philosophical question that mathematicians and philosophers of mathematics disagree, right? The two fundamental positions there are the Platonists and the constructivists. Platonists think that mathematical objects are actually mind independent, that they exist somewhere out there. Not that you can point a telescope and see them, but they are kind of mind independent. You know, the Pythagorean theorem, for instance, it's true, period. Even and it would be true
before Pythagoras.
Right, and it would be true even without human beings. And then there are the constructivists who say, no, mathematics is a human invention, and the reason it works so effectively is because it was in fact put together initially for practical purposes. Mathematics starts out historically as a series of tools to solve very practical problems, such as, dividing fields, agricultural fields, in according to geometrical figures, and so on and so forth. Who is right? I don't know. I have no idea. I'm suspicious of Platonists or Platonism in general, so I'm not sympathetic to that. But there is a very interesting question: what exactly is the relationship between mathematics and science? And I'll tell you one more to open up perhaps another way of thinking for some people in the audience. It's not clear what's the relationship between mathematics and logic either. Most people agree that logic and mathematics have sufficient similarities that they must belong to the same general category of thinking, because they both use axioms, they both are formalizations of certain ways of reasoning, they both use deductive inferences, and so on and so forth. And yet, when people have tried to reduce mathematics to logic, for instance, they failed abysmally. There is no way to reduce one to the other. So it's kind of interesting. These are really fascinating questions. What exactly is the relationship? But pragmatically speaking, I think science has to do with empirical evidence. Math and logic don't. But a very small subset of both math and logic are clearly very useful to science.
Would imagine. Can I have another question, please? College of Marin Geology. I'll bet I know who this person is.
It's the entire college.
No, I won't. He's obviously incognito. He or she is incognito today. One of two statements. We're going to go on to the next line, I'm sure. Regarding the Einstein alpha omega quote at the beginning, this strikes me as odd because his 1905 Annus Mirabilis papers were based on thought experiments.
Yeah.
We don't get experimental confirmation of relativity until 1919 with the Eddington eclipse. Were then Einstein's 1905 works scientific by his own definition?
Yes, they were. But they would not have been as successful. In fact, Einstein himself would not have been as successful until the 1919 solar eclipse. That eclipse literally made Einstein a worldwide figure overnight. The following day, newspapers all over the world had titles, gigantic titles with Einstein was right. Up until that point, that was very, very interesting theory. But it was science, because science does, of course, deal with theory. The claim that that particular claim that Einstein makes is, of course, in a broader context of his understanding of epistemology. He's not saying that science reduces only and exclusively to empirical evidence. He says that without empirical evidence ever, you do not get science. That doesn't mean that there are plenty of cases in the history of science where theoreticians get ahead of the empirical evidence, sometimes by decades. I mean, in this particular case, it was actually only a few years. But in many other cases in the history of physics, theoretical physicists got ahead of the empirical evidence by a long shot. And in fact, in some cases, we're still catching up. there is a lot of theoretical physics that has not, in fact, yet been tested empirically. But the point that he was making is fundamentally this: if there is no way to empirically test a theory, then really you cannot or should not call it science, or at the very least, you should be very, very uncomfortable about what's going on. That we're seeing one such situation in fundamental physics, and that is why there is the entire field of string theory is in trouble, right? Because when string theory was proposed early in the 1980s, as at the time was seen as the most promising new way forward in fundamental physics. It was assumed to be the most promising answer to the question of why is it that general relativity and quantum mechanics give you different contrasting answers when applied to some problems. And the idea is that there is a more fundamental theory, and string theory was by far the best candidate. But now we are several decades later, about half a century later, and string theory still had not proposed anything that is actually empirically verifiable, other than things that we already know. That is, there are a lot of post-dictions, as they call it, instead of predictions. So things that they rederive, things that we know that they rederive from string theory. That's fine, that's great, but it's not the same thing as the 1919 eclipse, right?
It isn't as strong.
Exactly.
It's not. You wouldn't bank on it quite as much.
Right.
The prediction is nice. I mean, remember that people have criticized our beloved evolution as not being a proper science because you can't make predictions. Right. Although you can, and you don't even have to squint real hard. but you can make postdictions like crazy.
Yeah, postdictions are much easier. Yes.
And it would. Yes, I agree.
So, in other words, the discussion there is that you don't do science without empirical evidence, but that doesn't imply that you cannot do theory for a significant amount of time before the empirical evidence catches up with you. That's certainly a possibility, and Einstein's own research clearly shows that.
I would tend to underscore with that, just as sort of a kind of a footnote or a parenthetical. It's, yes, the empirical evidence is essential, as Einstein said in the quote that you started us off with. But where the rubber really hits the road is testing. Mm-hmm. And the testing is against empirical evidence and at some level. Correct. And if you can't test it, then
you got a problem.
It's pretty hard. You might not be able to test it yet, which is, I think, the answer to Steve's question.
Sure.
But when will they be able to test strings theory, so to speak? We've been waiting, and of course, the multiverse also.
Oh, the multiverse is another good example. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Or
it fits a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
But
or different interpretations of quantum mechanics. They're pretty much all empirically equivalent, which is why. There are just as many philosophers of science that work on interpretation of quantum mechanics as there are physicists, because it is at the moment a philosophical question, meaning literally you do not have an empirical answer. Will we eventually able to get one? Perhaps. I mean, you never say never. But one of the problems with string theory is that string theorists themselves admit that the level of the energy levels that would be necessary to verify empirically some of the crucial predictions in the theory are, if not forever, are out of our reach by a very, very, very long shot. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of orders of magnitude beyond what we can do now. So then that's why some other people are saying, well, maybe then we should start looking at something else. Maybe we should start spending our time doing other things and looking for alternatives to for a unifying theory. Perhaps string theory, it's a dead end from that perspective. We don't know, but it's a legitimate question.
Howard wants to know, how would you sell, I think he says sell, how would you sell the value of uncertainty as the destiny of science?
Yeah. That's one thing that a lot of people are so uncomfortable, uncertainty.
You can't be uncomfortable with uncertainty and be a scientist.
No, that's right.
I mean, that's just, that's part of the DNA of science.
You would think so, but
people outside of science get very nervous about it.
Exactly. Certainly in the general public, that's the problem. It's also a problem because scientists themselves often, when they talk to the general public, don't do a good job at selling the nature of science and the nature of scientific uncertainty. And so often we get into trouble because some scientists or science popularizers make pronouncements as if they were, truth with the capital T kind of thing. While in fact they're not. They're all tentative. Every scientific statement, every empirical statement, I would say, is tentative. And it's interesting to me that we are here in the company of skeptics. If you go back into the history of skepticism, it really goes back to two schools of thought in ancient Greece, and one of them was the so-called skeptical phase of Plato's Academy. And those people were the first ones that introduced the notion of uncertainty. Up to that point, Plato himself was looking for the truth with the capital T. Allegedly, this is probably not true, but allegedly, at the entrance of Plato's Academy, there was this sign that said, "Thou shalt not enter unless you understand geometry." And why was that the case? Because geometry and mathematics were the standard, the golden standard of how you do things, because they produce certainty, right? The Pythagorean theorem is certain. There is no doubt that it is in fact true. And Plato wanted to apply that kind of approach to philosophy, including natural philosophy, that is, including science. The academic skeptics, who came about a century after Plato, those were people like Carneades in Athens and Cicero in Rome. Those were the first ones that said, no, you're not going to be able to do that. It's in the nature of things that our statements are always going to be tentative. In fact, it was Cicero that invented the word probabilis in Latin, from which we get probability. So that's where it came from. So yeah, we need to sell it, and I think the way to sell it is to explain how the nature of science itself. We don't do a good job. In college, where I teach at City College, we have a lot of nice introductory courses in sciences, but I'd be damned if there is much explanation about the nature of science itself.
Yeah.
And that is problematic, I think.
I found when I was at universities, before I went into my later career, that the nature of science was part and parcel of every single social science class I took.
Yeah.
And I never encountered it at all in the science classes.
Right.
But if I took a class in any anthropology class, whether it was cultural, archaeology, I only took one linguistics class, so I can't round up on that. But obviously, biological anthro, we just drove these kids nuts going with, and now we're going to have a unit on the nature of science, which of course is a terrible way to teach it, but nonetheless.
Yeah, right. But I think that's what needs to be done. In fact, before the college level. This needs to be done way before college level.
And it needs to be done not the way it is traditionally done, and which I think the great ship of education is starting to shift slightly with much more experiential education and so forth, rather than just memorizing a recipe.
Yeah.
Well, here you collect information and then you do. Right. But I want to toss out one other little comment. I'd like your view, because one of the things that drives me nuts about general public, but even many scientists, when they say, well, we don't know anything.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And that drives me nuts, because obviously we know a whole bunch. And I think we should try to communicate that there are degrees of uncertainty. I mean, correct. I don't think anybody's ever going to change our mind about the planets going around the sun.
That's right.
That's a keeper.
That's right. That's
right. We're not going to change about that.
Yeah.
And when you heat substances, the molecules go faster. I mean, there's stuff that we don't really we're not saying, but there's a probability that we're wrong. No, we're not going to be wrong about that stuff. Right. There's a philosopher who came up with this. I heard it first from Jim Trefil, the physicist, and I've used it for years. But somebody, actually a theologian friend of mine, said, "Oh, that was so-and-so's idea." And I said, "Who?" I thought Jim invented it. But the idea that there are core ideas of science.
Right.
planets go around the sun, not the other way around. Those are keepers. Then there's the frontier of science, which is what's going on in science. And then, of course, there's our favorite, the fringe. You know, and
Right.
if you
Yeah.
conceive of three concentric circles, the fringe are areas that nobody in real science is paying any attention to. And the reason why is because the fringe areas, our beloved pseudosciences, the fringe areas are out there in the nowhereville because they contradict some
The core.
aspect of
Yeah.
core knowledge.
Correct.
And the core knowledge, we don't bother testing anymore. We don't think it's uncertain. It's there. They're grabbers.
Yeah.
We're happy with it.
Right.
Frontier, yeah, we're going to argue about that. Some of those ideas will go into the core. Most of them won't. They'll be reworked. They'll be worked, and eventually we'll kind of stumble into more ideas going in the core. But a whole lot of those ideas are going to end up in the fringe, where they should be abandoned.
Yeah, I think that's right. There was a philosopher of science back in the 60s and 70s, Imre Lakatos, who was talking about scientific ideas work with the core, and then there's a protective belt, and then there's this other stuff. Yes, it was Lakatos.
I know. Sorry, Jim, you're not going to get credit anymore.
Oh, well. And I think that's a good model of thinking about science. Yeah. One of the ways, however, you can sort of mix it up in this kind of discussion is to bring up a concept that some philosophers of science have been debating for a while, which is called the pessimistic meta-induction. You've heard of this thing? Oh, this is one of my favorite things because it tends to piss off or confuse people, and therefore it's a good way to start a conversation. So the pessimistic meta-induction is an induction, of course, is a generalization from past experience or from a sample to a larger sample or to future happenings, right? So great, that's a basic tool of inference for human beings, particularly used in science. In fact, science works a lot by induction. Okay, the pessimistic meta-induction says that history of science shows that every single scientific theory in the past turned out to be wrong at some point later on. So by induction...
It drives me nuts. That's the thing that drives me nuts, because that's not true.
Well, isn't it?
Because we're never going to go back to the idea that the sun goes around the planets.
True. But the point is...
That doesn't mean we're not going to learn more about heliocentrism and we're going to change some of our views. But that's not the same thing as saying everything we know about heliocentrism is wrong.
No, it doesn't. But much here hinges on what one means by wrong, right? So for instance, the Copernican theory was definitely wrong, because Copernicus assumed that the planets will go around in circles and instead they go on in ellipses, okay? So that was wrong, but it certainly was far less wrong than Ptolemy, right?
Wrong in detail.
Right. Well, it was a fairly big detail because the calculations really didn't come out very even close to what they should have been. But the point is much less wrong than what came before. So, and you can keep going like this. You know, Kepler improved the situation significantly, of course. In fact, most of what we use these days is essentially the Keplerian theory of the solar system. But in fact, one could argue reasonably that Einstein modified things again, complicated things again, because it actually showed that there is no preferential frame of reference, in which case, technically, it's not true that the planets go around the sun.
So are we going to say that Einstein's wrong?
No, not right now. Right now, we think that he's right? But the pessimistic meta-induction works like this. Looking in the past, the reason we know better, so to speak, now, or the reason we accept Einstein or we accept quantum mechanics, etc., it's because, of course, at some level, whatever came before turned out to be incorrect at one level or another. If that's true, then by induction, you would conclude that current scientific theories are also going to be true, unless you think that we live in a special moment in history where finally we got it right and we're not going to move anymore, which is not what you would probably believe. Now, the whole thing is meant simply to make people pause and think about the nature of scientific discovery, right? About the fact that, oh, if I actually take a look at the history of science, things become interesting. I learned a lot more probably about how science works from a serious look at the history of science than from any kind of generic introductory course on the scientific method or whatever, however the people teach it this way. I think that's a good reason why we should teach history or philosophy of science, because it does teach a much better understanding of the nature of science than if you take an actual science course. Because especially in the natural sciences, as you pointed out, usually they don't teach that kind of stuff. They give you a lot of details.
Physicists were worse. They just sort of assumed they would absorb it, because they're doing it. Anyway, I digress. May we have another question, please? Strick9 says, is Massimo thinking of going back to the 6-step scientific method? That's basically it.
I am not sure that I know even what the 6-step scientific method is. One of the things that it's increasingly clear, has been increasingly clear in philosophy of science, is that there is no such a thing as a scientific method. If by that one means a recipe or an algorithm to which scientists actually they use in their day-to-day work. I've been a scientist for decades, and I never used something called the scientific method. What I did was we came up with some ideas, we meaning myself, my graduate students, my postdocs, etc., or my colleagues. We came up with some interesting ideas, and then we would rack our brain to figure out how do we actually test this thing on empirical grounds. Yeah, and the test was always different. It was, you have to make up stuff as you go. You basically become an extreme pragmatist. It's whatever works. And some things work one time, and then they're not going to work another time. And so you have to start from scratch. So there is really no formal method. There are, of course, some generalizations you can make about how science works, for sure. But, I think it's not by chance that the way we learn science these days is by apprenticeship. You become somebody's student as first as an undergraduate, then as a PhD level, and then eventually as a postdoc. And you learn the way in which people learned how to paint from Michelangelo or to make sculptures from Michelangelo. You go into their workshop and you observe people doing it, and you learn little by little how to do it. And I bet that a lot of scientists would actually be hard pressed if you all of a sudden were to ask them, so what's your method? Can you write it down? I mean, they would have trouble. They would come up with some kind of, platitude like, it's about hypothesis testing or something like that. But
I mean, I dealt with the general public. I was not, after I left the university, I wasn't training future scientists.
Right. Yeah.
And the idea of, and I'm not talking about training. I want the general public to understand more about why they can trust science. Yeah. And they can trust science because it does have some commonalities. Granted, maybe most scientists wouldn't be able to say, well, geez, I don't know. I guess, I wanted to test this idea. Bingo. All right. That's what we need to know. Yeah. It's testing ideas, and that's the baseline. I would be happy if the general public understood that science works because you test it and it's iterative, and you test it again and you come back and we really don't need to go into a great deal of detail.
And look, to some extent, it works a lot like detective work. That's why Sherlock Holmes is one of my favorite readings. Which I, in fact, occasionally assign to my students. Because although Conan Doyle says in several of the novels that Holmes uses the deductive method, because that was a buzzword at the time,
yes,
Holmes doesn't use the deductive method. Holmes uses whatever works. Sometimes it's deduction, sometimes it's induction, sometimes it's the generalization, sometimes it's a inference to the best explanation. It's whatever it is. But he goes about it with method. And the commonality of all of this is that he thinks critically about the evidence. Right? That's the commonality, and in that sense, that's what science does. That's what we do. It's critical thinking applied to evidence. That's the most general thing you can say, I think, about science.
And I think one of the hardest things to get across to the public is that science is reliable, even if it's okay to change.
Oh, that's a good question. Can you read it?
Peter says, is Massimo a scientific realist or anti-realist? Are unobservable entities referred to by scientific theories real things or merely useful fictions?
That's a damn good question. So perhaps I should very briefly explain what a realist or an anti-realist is. This is a long, ongoing debate in philosophy of science. And although the debate itself is unresolved, and I myself have shifted occasionally from one place to another, I know for a fact that the overwhelming majority of philosophers of science are realists. But that doesn't mean that the other position is not interesting. So what does it mean to be realist or anti-realist? Take a unobservable, like electrons, for instance, meaning something that you cannot actually put under a microscope, you cannot look at with your eyes, and so on and so forth. You infer the existence of electrons. If you're a realist, what you're saying is that, look, I cannot see these things, but I can describe their properties, and these properties allow me to infer the actual existence of a particular thing, which I'm going to call a particle or a particle wave or whatever it is, and that is a real thing. That's a real physical entity, okay? The anti-realist says, no, that's not what you're doing. You are proposing a model that accounts for the evidence, okay, that accounts for the phenomena, so to speak. But the model itself, but there are many models that would account for that evidence, and the model itself it's not enough to tell you what actually is out there. You don't know what the physical reality of that thing is. All you know is that you have currently a model that fits the evidence pretty well. But in the future, you might come up with a different kind of model, or a model that fits better, or a number of alternative models. So that's the anti-realist position, that science, the idea that science is not in the business of describing reality, but it's in the business of proposing models that are empirically adequate. Now, as I said, most philosophers of science, and usually on most days, I myself am a realist. However, there are some interesting issues in certain areas of science where the debate really becomes complex and interesting. So nobody is a anti-realist, let's say, about planets, stuff you can see, right? Yeah, they're planets, they're there, we can describe them, we see them, fine. The anti-realism becomes relevant only for things that are unobservable. And of course, what's observable depends on your instrumentation. So you can always make the argument that, well, something may be unobservable now, but if we wait another 50 years or 100 years, it may become observable. So there is that issue to take into account. But then there are things like, you know, some physicists, for instance, fundamental physicists, interpret the wave function, which is a fundamental entity describing quantum mechanics, mathematical entities describing quantum mechanics. They interpret it in realist terms. So they think it's an actual physical thing, as opposed to a mathematical representation of reality. I don't know. I don't know what does it even mean for the wave function to be physical. We don't have a concept. We cannot imagine what that actually would mean. So when you push it to those levels, quite frankly, I wouldn't take a position or the other. I would say, I have no idea. I am agnostic about this thing. As far as I can tell, the wave function is an interesting mathematical construct. It's a very useful mathematical construct. Whether it corresponds to reality, a physical reality out there, I don't know, and nobody else knows. So I'm edging here, but I think in most cases I'm a realist, and occasionally I'm tempted by the anti-realist position in specific circumstances.
Okay, may we have the next question, please? Can you talk about how your work on Stoicism informs your work on Scientism?
That's an interesting one. Well, you know, I don't really work on Stoicism in the sense that my background is certainly not in classical, you know, ancient philosophy. I don't write scholarly papers with a couple of exceptions, on Stoicism. What I do is I practice Stoicism the way somebody would practice Buddhism, let's say. Right. So to me, Stoicism is a philosophy of life, not a theoretical sort of inquiry. That said, the Stoics came with an interesting epistemology and an interesting view of how things work, and the nature of human knowledge, and so on and so forth. So you cannot avoid but think about those kind of issues, and that certainly does inform not only my views on scientism, but actually my views on science in general, or human knowledge in general. But I don't think it's necessarily Stoicism per se. It's just having been trained as a philosopher that naturally leads you to questions about, wait a minute, there's this group of people here that says these kind of things, but what kind of warrant do they have for saying those kind of things? So I wouldn't claim that it comes directly from Stoicism, but it certainly comes from the general philosophical background.
I think that's a very good question to end on. I will thank you profusely for spending your time with us. I know it's very late from the East Coast, and we're all feeling pretty spry here over on the West Coast, but we very much appreciate our East Coast guests for burning the midnight oil with us. This was really great, Massimo. This was so much fun.
It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me, and hopefully we'll do it again.
I would love to do that. I'm going to hold you to it. Thank you. Now, the rest of you, wait here for a moment. Let me tell you about our January speaker. Our very first speaker for 2025 is going to be the science reporter from Science Magazine, Ann Gibbons. She hasn't given me a title yet. She got delayed this week, but it will be something about human evolution, I assure you. So do join us next month, January 9th. This is another East Coast speaker, so we will be meeting again early at 6:30 again, like we met this month. Have a great holiday, all of you, and I look forward to seeing everybody next January. Thanks for coming tonight. Good night.